Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Sharone Mitchell, Jr. I'm the Cook County Public Defender. I am stepping in. I got big shoes to fill. Sarah Staudt, you all know and lover of Chicago Appleseed, is going through some difficulties. So I will be stepping in to moderate this incredible conversation. Welcome to our virtual two-part pro bono spotlight event, where Chicago Appleseed Center for Fair Courts and the Chicago Council for Lawyers will be celebrating our volunteers and community partners. We have an incredible array of panelists. I feel blessed to be in the room with three of the best attorneys I know. We have Tanya Woods, who runs the Westside Justice Center, is just a shining beacon in the community. We have April Preyar of Shiller, Preyar, Jarard, and Samuels, longtime criminal defense attorney, an excellent social media follow. I need a board game quickly here. And Cathryn Crawford of Lawndale Christian Legal Center, one of the best attorneys I know, one of the best criminal defense attorneys I know. Thank you all so much for being with us today.
We're happy to be here.
Super happy to be here.
Before we get into our conversation, I want to talk a little bit about what Chicago Appleseed does. You know, it breaks into three things: research, conducting mixed method research and used to support community-led and community-supported solutions to systematic injustices. It's about advocacy, advocating for equitable, evidence-based, anti-racist policies and practices that make our legal system more accessible and less harmful. And education, talking about how we educate the public on how to best access their rights in courts, educating legislators, lawyers, and activists on how to improve access for their constituents, clients, and communities. And the focuses are criminal justice, policing, immigration courts, and family law. So this is really a dynamic organization doing great work, and we are going to have, I hope to have, a really excellent conversation. So, you know, let's start off here. We are talking about how things have changed since the Floyd uprising, since the Taylor uprising. Certainly we've seen people all across the country hit the streets and demand change. And these movements have been going on for quite some time. So we're going to be talking a little bit about how that has affected the courts, but I really want to start off with you, Tanya, and talk a little bit about the community piece of this. And then we'll talk a little bit about the courts and things of that nature. But how are things different in the community after the uprisings?
Sure. Thank you so much, Sharone. It's a pleasure to be here with my colleagues today and with all of you, the viewing and listening audience. To give some context, not only am I an attorney, but I'm also a native. And by native, I mean I was born and raised on Chicago's West Side. So I have not only the privilege of being able to do this work on the West Side of Chicago in the East Garfield Park neighborhood, but it's the community that I came from. I grew up in K-Town, went to local schools on the West Side of Chicago, went to local schools in western suburbs, went to college and law school right here in Chicago. So to say that, I kind of know a little bit about what's happening in the community, I think I have a little bit of that privilege, but also to recognize that the work didn't start with us today. The work did not start with the death of George Floyd or any of the other folks that have become household names. What really changed was, I think, the moment and time that we're in right now. So many of our friends and colleagues from the Black Panther Party, from the Civil Rights Movement, from the Harold Washington era say, the present is just the past being repeated again. What's really different is we had this unintended, unexpected, unforeseen global pandemic, which shut us all up in our homes. It gave us one global problem to focus on. It hit us all equally and ever present, regardless of what our race was, our demographic, our socioeconomic background. And it forced us to start staring at the television and listening to the radio all at the same time. In my opinion, that became kind of the critical moment in which stories like George Floyd and so many others became household names. It forced people who were not paying attention to suddenly begin paying attention. It raised the level of importance and significance of grassroots organizations and folks who have been toiling in this vineyard for decades that now became household names. So while we may be familiar with the work of Chicago Appleseed or First Defense Legal Aid or and so many others that have been out here doing this work, the Westside Justice Center just happens to come along at a moment in less than 5 years when all of this is kind of coming together. We're certainly privileged to be here at this moment, but it would be an understatement to say that things have really changed in so much as that the work that's been being done for decades is now coming to the forefront, and people who ordinarily had the privilege of not being able to pay attention to it have to suddenly pay attention to it. But we've always had movements that were intergenerational. We've always had movements that have involved the people that were directly affected and afflicted and joined by allies. But certainly this moment that we all have to pay attention along with technology, which is also giving us other avenues to be able to focus on the same thing at the same time, has certainly heightened the awareness of some of these issues, in my opinion. And we need to hear you, Sharone.
I know, listen, the most famous phrase over the last 15 months, sir, you are on mute. April or Cathryn, I want to see if you guys want to jump in. That was great, Tanya.
I would agree with much of what Tanya said. It's a moment in time that's significant for all of us, not just because of George Floyd's death, but also because of the pandemic. So in terms of the courts, I actually have not seen any changes as a result of George Floyd's protests, killing, the subsequent trial of his killer, Chauvin. I have not seen any changes. But what I have seen is, like Tanya said, it made us all more aware, but I think it also made us all more aware of our own individual power. Because I think that's what's been lost for the last several years is, yes, there are grassroots organizations that have been doing this work. There are law firms, there are public defenders' offices, the list goes on about who's been doing this work, kind of putting our heads down and doing that daily grind. But what changed is that young people came together and decided that they refused to be silenced. And there started to be changes as a result. So even though the courts, I don't think, have been directly impacted yet, there are changes coming down the pike, not only in Illinois, but across the nation. One, in local municipalities, they've started passing ordinances. Two, they've all started taking a look at the police procedures in their particular towns and cities. On a larger scale, state legislators have all sat down and proposed legislation. So I think a lot of changes will be coming down the pike, even though I don't think the courts have seen many changes thus far. But I really do think we saw the power of our own individual voice. We saw how powerful we could be when we all come together. And like Tanya said, because we were all stuck in our homes, at least the obedient ones among us were stuck in our homes, we were forced to kind of focus on this awful crisis that had happened in Minnesota. And then another crisis came up and another crisis. And it was almost like we couldn't turn away. Because what I often tell people is that the police misconduct isn't new. So I started off as a public defender. I went into private practice, just solely doing criminal defense. And then a few years in, I started also suing cops for beating up people, tasering people, shooting unarmed people. And what I saw in all those experiences is that this was happening all along. The only thing that's new is these. The telephone can capture what's happening no matter where you are. And now we're all in horror, shock, and in awe when we see these happen in front of us. And that's the difference about George Floyd's death, is not only that it was captured on film, but it was captured in the length of the incident. The length of the incident is what's so jarring, so shocking, what was so appalling, because honestly, we've seen others die on camera, but this one there was no gun involved. He was crushed to death. literally under the knee of a white man. And that was just such a parallel to how Black folks have felt and been treated in this nation for so long. So again, I think the changes are coming down the pike in terms of the courts. I don't know how significant they'll be, because what's really broken is the culture in these police departments. And it doesn't really matter what the law is. If you have the same training officers enforcing new standards, they're still going to have that same old culture.
Yeah, April, I think that you are correct that, they say that practice or eats policy for breakfast or lunch or dinner or something, the phrase. And that I think we see that every day. I do think it is important, though, to think about those steps that we have taken. We haven't seen the direct changes at 26th Street substantively, but we have seen lots of energy from folks hitting the streets and kind of moving legislators to kind of make changes. And it's kind of on, I think, us as professionals to ensure that we are taking advantage of that energy so that we can really take advantage of this moment. And that's why I'm so proud to partner with Appleseed and CCL, things like the Pretrial Fairness Act, which we won't see most of the effects till 2023, but it was a momentous kind of occasion. There's no reason to spike the football, right? There are still thousands and thousands and thousands of policy and practices to change. But we are in a place now where we were able to do something which significantly reduces the state's power to detain somebody. And through the work assistance of Appleseed and CCL, we're able to get that done. Work like around course costs and fees, right? Again, court costs are out of control, and they'll be out of control even after these reforms, but at least making a little bit of movement of that. And currently in the Station House representation is something I'm really proud to partner with Chicago Appleseed and CCL on doing that work. With that said, I cannot say enough. We are not at the point where we can be spiking any footballs. So I want to go over to you, Cathryn. You are in the courts, either virtually or in real life, and growingly more in real life every day. Could you talk a little bit about this question about how you've seen criminal justice system change or criminal legal system change in this era of quote unquote justice reform?
Sure. And I'm just going to note for the record that it's clear that Tanya and I are in the same neighborhood because both of our internet connections went out at the same time. So I just want to, I want to give a little bit of background of who Lawndale Christian Legal Center is, because I think that's important to understand the context from which I'm coming. We are a community-based organization in North Lawndale neighborhood. We represent young people 24 and under who are accused either in juvenile or criminal court. Because we are community-based and we are in the community, we are very familiar with the police officers who are in our community. Our community members know each other, we know each other, and it's given us a really interesting and unique perspective in terms of being able to identify patterns and areas of growth, or in more aptly non-growth, especially right now. So I really thought, and so did my colleagues and some of my clients, I really thought that the pandemic combined with George Floyd was really going to result in some significant changes in how the system actors viewed and treated the young people that I walk into court with. I really thought it would. I thought these judges have been forced at home to live with their family members and, in close quarters. They've got to know that that drives you crazy. And, imagine if you were like in a house with like 6 people and, one bedroom, surely they're going to understand, they're going to approach electronic monitoring differently. I thought for sure that when we saw the murder of George Floyd and the anger of the communities afterwards, that people who had reflexively been sort of distancing themselves from the realities of the constant abuse, systemic abuse of Black and brown people, they would look at it differently, because that's what I was being told on the news. I mean, April talked about everybody was glued to their televisions. I was being told that America was going through a racial reckoning. And there were these book clubs and white people were reading books about white privilege and, and God, I have been very distraught to see that it really hasn't penetrated the doors of 26th in California and the other criminal courthouses. It's really been shockingly dispiriting to me. And I've been doing this for a really long time. And so the fact that I had this faith, it's really been distressing. But, and I say but, April was being optimistic. I mean, I will say that with the passage of the Pretrial Fairness Act, that was like a breath of fresh air. And we were like so excited that Illinois legislators with JJI's help and CCL and everybody else, Illinois legislatures passed this amazing legislation that really does say, like, we're going to treat pretrial detention differently. We're going to get rid of cash money bail. You can't lock people up unless they truly, truly, truly are dangerous. So I have some faith if the judges actually apply the law, which will, is another question altogether. But what I will say is this, and I can give details or not, but I will say that, there's the thing that's the most frustrating about 26th Street and the other courthouses, there's no consistency. You do have some judges, you do have some prosecutors, you even do have some police officers who are like, whoa, you know what? I felt this way for a long time, and now I have the freedom to actually act on my beliefs in treating people humanly, or people who are like, maybe I should be thinking about this a little bit different. But you have so many more that are not, and some who are actually digging in deeper. And there's been sort of a backlash, saying like, this is not about, I had a prosecutor say, everything is not about racial justice. The fact that your client was transferred as a juvenile has nothing to do with race. Really? 198 out of 199 kids that were transferred during that time period were Black or brown. Like, that's a reality. So individual fights, I think that part of the issue, the challenges forward is getting people to have to change. And right now I just cling to those courtrooms where people are acting in good faith, and cling to those judges that have the courage to call out or punish police misconduct, and hope that others will follow suit. But I'm looking for everyone's insights as to how we can make them do that.
Well, Sharone, if you don't mind, I'd love to just kind of piggyback on Cathryn and what April are both saying, which is that moment of despair when we realize that the change that we all hoped for, the big reckoning, right, is still a surprise. So it reminds me of this SNL sketch when Hillary Clinton lost everybody knows what I'm talking about, right? Because it's iconic, right? So the Black people are in the room with white people and they're watching the election returns, and the white people are like, oh my God, we're losing, right? And the Black people are like, of course we're losing. Did you all not know we were not going to win this election, right? Why are you all surprised, So I will speak for myself that as sometimes I look at the landscape, it is as if, as Cathryn is just like, this is so disappointing. There are people like me and others who are like, we're not shocked. We knew this wasn't the big reckoning or the big revolution. What we knew was that some people were uncomfortable, right? What we knew is that some people are going to be uncomfortable just enough just to do something a little bit different. But those who are firmly in power are not just going to give up the power, right? They're not just gonna be, oh, Tanya, all of you guys are right. We're so wrong all these years. Here, you can have the power. We're gonna share the power. That is not how power brokering works. People don't wake up one day and decide to share the wealth. So the work still has yet to be done, and will continue to have to be done. What that looks like and what form that's going to take, that is what yet remains. Whether that will happen in our lifetime, in our playing field or not. Will that be a big, revolution? Will that be the big tearing down and abolition of systems that we know don't work, right? Or will it be this continued incremental change, these aha moments? And I'll tell one last story. I sat through one of these DEI training type things, right? So you sit on a board and they say, oh, it's been a terrible year. We should all get this training. And I said, can we just promise ourselves not to give ourselves the same training we got in 1985? Because I was graduating from high school and I would really not like to have the same training now as a 50-year-old woman, right? So it was like shock and like aghast, like, what do you mean? What are you talking about? It's going to be different. And you know where I'm going with this. It was absolutely not different, right? Somebody gave us a history lesson about the Civil War and slavery and taught us about Madam C.G. Walker and Martin Luther King, and him and, you know, Malcolm X were really good friends, you know, and it was like One Night in Miami was the best movie ever, right? So it's just, you know, we're saying to ourselves, you know, now that we're past this moment again, you know, where is the true systemic change? And even to Cathryn's point about the amazing criminal justice omnibus bill and so many others that came out of the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, it came out of the Illinois Legislative Black Caucus, right? It didn't come out of the Republican caucus. It didn't come out of the other folks that have the power again. It came out of the same places we would expect it to come from, which are the people that represent the people who are already being oppressed. And it takes some of those folks to tell you that some of the stuff that's in the omnibus bill was some stuff that was 20 years ago or 25 years ago. Half of the stuff has just been recycled, the language updated, but it's stuff that folks have been asking for a while. So while we can certainly celebrate that, because again, we're at this moment where we can see that omnibus bill being pushed through, you know, the systemic change yet still has to happen. And it will have to take place with or without the cooperation of the people who are in power.
Tanya, I appreciate your movie criticism in particular. Always got to throw that in there. April, I'm sorry, I want to apologize, everyone. My internet decided to just hate me. Has April gotten a chance to weigh in? Okay, so I want to turn then to what do we do? I mean, and I'm going to pop it right back to Tanya because you just gave the call. What is it that we do to force change?
So this is what I'm going to do. So I saw my colleague's mouth to start to open just a little bit, because she and I know have collectively been on 1,299 panels that says, what is the problem and what do we do? So that's like, we want to stop asking those same questions, right? We want to stop saying like, what is the problem and what do we do? And let us get, you know, the brightest and best minds on the Zoom screen at the same time, right? We would like to be able to think more deeply and more intentionally about this instead of like that surface level flyby, right? Like, what do we do next? We know what to do, right? And we know who has to do it. It just will require the bravery and the courage, the tenacity and the fortuitousness of the people who are empowered to do what needs to be done. And then that takes us to the next step. Like, if it doesn't happen, then what will happen? And that's the big thing that we're all eating popcorn waiting to see, right? Is like, what will happen from the next generation that April talks so eloquently about, that refuses to take these same tools of the trade, the same tools of movement politics, and doing something totally different and radical. And I'm all for that, you know, like I'm all for the radical. And that's the kind of change that we're going to have happen. If April wants to talk about the specifics, I'm happy to throw it to her.
Yeah, I just wanted to chime in about a few things. So one, I think we got to put pressure on those in power. And even if it is, like Tanya said, just the ones we have access to. So the Illinois reform bill that was proposed by the Illinois, I always say it wrong, Black Legislative Caucus, I actually sat in on that phone call. And so what I was impressed about by them is legislators, my complaint about them is they usually don't talk to the people who with boots on the ground. And so they pass these bills based on these lofty ideas, and they have no idea how it's going to play out in a courtroom or on a corner. And so when they actually sat down with, I think there were 7 of us on the call, everybody was Black except for my law partner. It was all attorneys. One was a former judge and an appellate justice. And we just spitballed it. And we talked about, nope, y'all got this wrong. You don't go to court. We do. This is what you need to see differently. Nope, this is how cops play games with body cameras. So you can give them all body cameras and they're still going to block each other by standing behind each other or turning the sound off or turning the camera off. And so I say put pressure on people like that. Yes, and it's great to have these bills passed, But like I always say, whether it's legislation, whether it's police reform, it takes time. It's not going to happen in 30 minutes. It's not going to happen in 30 days. And in the meantime, I got clients who are getting stopped tonight, getting beat up by cops tomorrow, and possibly getting killed. So I am all for policy as an idea. It's lofty in its loftiness, but I believe that grassroots organizing is what has the greatest impact. That teaching families how to not react when stopped by police is life-saving. And that's why I developed a board game, which teaches just that. That's why I do videos for free on Facebook teaching just that, because that's what we're not taught in the schools. That's what we're not taught in the churches. That's what we're taught wrong by our parents. They say stuff like, oh, baby, just tell the truth. The truth could send you to prison for 45 years, but mama didn't tell you that. And so I would just throw that out. And so I do believe, like I said, we'll see policy change, but I think that grassroots organizing, being creative, thinking outside the box. And the other thing we have to put pressure on these legislators about, not just the Black ones, is throwing some money at those of us who are actually doing the work. Those of us, so we're not out here bootstrapping our businesses. We're not out here trying to figure out how to get the gas money to get to the speaking engagements to go save the babies. They need to be able to throw some money at these organizations who are out here doing the work that they are too lazy or too disinterested in doing themselves, and support the Chicago Appleseeds and support the Westside Justice Center, but also support the smaller organizations out here that are doing the work daily. So that's my 2 cents.
I really want to thank you both. I really want to thank you both for that, because I think you're completely right that we ask the same questions every time. One thing that I have been excited about, I'm going to puff them up a little bit, is that our movement managed to get somebody in power who is someone who's been walking the walk and talking the talk, and that is Sharon Mitchell, who's on the panel and is the public defender of Cook County, which really, when that was announced, I could not have been happier. And of course, he is a former Appleseed board member, so we were also super proud as an organization. But we have moved from an interesting position of having been colleagues to him being in a position where, he's really working alongside the people who have the power to change things with the stroke of a pen. And so I would like to pop it over to him to ask him what is it that we need to be doing, and what is it that needs to change within the system? And is there a route there, or is it really completely, is it hopeless? I don't think it is, but I'd be interested to hear.
No, I don't think it's hopeless. And I think what we saw with the Black Caucus the last few months proves that it's not hopeless. I think about a quote that my friend Charlene Gray stole from somebody else. That is, lawyers advise what's possible. It's a job of organizers to change what's possible. And I think this is exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing people on the ground changing the structures, changing the reality so that we can get different outcomes. I think when it comes down to it, policy is important, and I've been a policy guy, and I've worked for the last 5-6 years trying to change the policy when it comes to what happens when somebody's accused of a crime. But more important than policy is people. And like Sarah said, there are 5 or 6 or 7 people with the stroke of a pen can fundamentally change our neighbors, our brothers, and our sisters' interactions with the justice system. So I think it's incredibly important to keep them accountable. Now, this is not some type of PSA for voting. I think we should vote, but just when people say, just go vote, that's not enough. But what I think it is important is to keep the pressure on the folks that make the decisions around how we define public safety. Too often we've defined public safety as how long somebody goes to prison, how often we're putting people in prison, and how far we can lock people away from their communities. And we have an emerging set of leaders who are from the community, who are trying to instruct the rest of us on the fact that is not public safety. Public safety is access to opportunity. Public safety is housing. Public safety is economy. Public safety is being able to grow up and do the things you want to do for your community. And the opposite of public safety is putting people in cages, destroying their ability to earn, throwing billions and billions of dollars into the carceral system, which only supports people in the Northwest Side and the Southwest Side in job creation programs, i.e. law enforcement, and really thinking about how we're supporting our communities. So I think it's about policy, and policy is important, but it's also about people and thinking about who are the people that are making decisions and how we can force them to make better decisions. And we saw a little bit of that, I think, with the Black Caucus's bill, but that should be just the first step. We should be demanding this. This should be the norm, not the exception to the rule. And we should be thinking extremely hard about how we can protect the changes that we've made, right? So we're going forward, not just going backwards, which we've seen in other jurisdictions.
So actually, I'm going to take a cue from April and Tanya and branch off a little and talk about those people. I'm like, let's talk strategy. Okay, we know who these decision makers are. There's judges, there's prosecutors, there's city officials who control the police. I will say, like, the police industrial complex. Let's start with judges. What needs to be changed there, and how can we do it? I feel like this is something that's very close to Appleseed's heart, and we often don't talk about it enough. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So I think that there's sort of the systemic, judges thinking about like sort of the whole notion of the continued use of the associate judgeship, which is a holdover from when we actually had a shortage of judges, and it allows for the judges themselves to select associates who are not elected. And I think if you look at who are associates, there are many of them that are reversed an awful lot, many of whom are considered to be entirely too deferential to the state, and some of whom exhibit what people could legitimately call racist behavior. There's also, I think that Chief Judge Evans has done a really good job at trying to set the tone, for example, on bond reform. But the fact is that he issued a general order, and a lot of his judges aren't following it. And so what needs to happen is when Chief Judge Evans tells judges, this is what you're supposed to do, and they don't do it, he needs to find a way to hold them accountable. There are judges who routinely set unaffordable bonds and basically make no bones about the fact that they are setting unaffordable bonds, even though there is no danger to the safety of people. I think that the media should stop pandering to this gun violence narrative. And quite honestly, I think that Kim Foxx is in a really strong position right now to really force systemic internal changes, because she's got a lot of really great policies and she's got a lot of really great vision. But when you go into, particular courtrooms, that vision is not being realized. And, as a defense lawyer, I'd like to call out these prosecutors, but then we worry about, sort of what kind of backlash we're going to have. Like, what is my obligation as a defense lawyer when I see prosecutors filing petitions for violations of bail bonds because my client, who's been on electronic monitoring for close to 1,000 days, actually had the audacity to leave his house to buy a pair of shoes, right? What do we do when that judge locks up a guy for violating EM, for a technical violation, for getting his kids out of the car when his ex-wife brought them? I can try to promote that. I can raise motions. I can file appeals, but really it's the people, the chief judge and the presiding judges who have a responsibility to start looking at what their colleagues are doing and saying, hey, maybe let's talk about what it really means to provide individualized determinations. Or, the prosecutor's office saying, let's look at, should we bring this as a felony gun charge? What circumstances are leading these young kids on the West Side to carry these guns? Is it possible that, as the lawyers are saying, that this is for their defense and not because they intend to go shoot people? So for me, those are the actors that I have access to, but I don't have any power on. And those are the ones that I think could make fundamental difference in individual people's lives, people that I am walking in the courtroom with every day.
For me, I think it becomes this and. It becomes our personal responsibility to rebuke the binary, if you will, as if it only our solutions are this or that, judges or law enforcement or legislation, policy or grassroots. At some point, we have to reckon with and embrace that it's this and all of the above. It's E. It's always E. A through D are all the right answers. At the same time, equal pressure, consistent pressure. But I can't help but go back to, as Cathryn pointed out, these are the actors that she has access to. It's in those small places as well as the big places. So I would offer that it's both systemic as well as individual advocacy that must take place at the same time when we think about solutions. And so it's grassroots as well as policy. It's you in your private club. It's you at your bar association dinner or luncheon or conversation about judges and being brave enough and courageous enough to say the things that need to be said without fear of retribution the next time you as a lawyer appear in that courtroom or in others. It's being in those other spaces where you have agency as a person that's part of the power structure and do something with that agency. And so, you know, what groups are you talking to? What groups are you a part of? What are you doing in those spaces when you go outside of the courtroom to affect change? And when you are a part of the system, whether that be the prison industrial complex or the educational industrial complex or the not-for-profit industrial complex, or put whatever in front and call it industrial complex, what are you doing as a part of that system? So as a part of the not-for-profit machinery, if you will, what we do with our dollars that come from the government are spread them around to as many grassroots emerging organizations that are just like the Westside Justice Center. We don't build a bigger Westside Justice Center, but we try to uplift and elevate the work that's being done by folks like Lawndale Christian and other places across the state and spread that wealth around so that others can be able to affect change right where they are, instead of continuing to play a part in that not-for-profit industrial complex that sometimes binds our hands and feet so that we can't do the work that we know needs to be done. To April's point about the public safety, this whole conversation about what safety means to me and then how it gets interpreted in other places, we've got to unpack that and stop kind of like talking around it. Because what safety means to me and what it may mean in another community might be two totally different things. I live in the 19th ward, and when the police drive around in SUVs, I'm actually not afraid that anybody's looking at me, right? But if I were in a different neighborhood, I might be concerned that SUV is driving around looking at me. Now, that's only because I've been living here for 30 years, not necessarily because I feel safe, right? It's just that I know that when the SUVs are driving around, there's a different, or how they go about the driving around in the 19th ward may look very different than what it looks like at 60612, where we are on California. So I say all that to say is there are no single answers, but as Cathryn has pointed out, wherever you are, you have the ability to affect both individual and systemic change. And you got to ask yourself every day you wake up, what are you doing with that agency?
Are there other thoughts? I want to move to prosecutors. We there, but I would like to talk Amanda.
You're breaking up really
what
bad.
Exactly we do, because that's another person who could change a heck of a lot with a stroke of a pen.
I think we all got her question, but she faded out.
Yeah. Yeah, I think she wanted to talk about prosecutors. Wants to talk about prosecutors.
Well, I'll say this. I'm probably the most pessimistic person on the panel. I'm sorry. I have the same opinion of prosecutors as I do of cops. And that is, I'll start with this. So I sat on a panel with Kim Fox, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago. And I recall her saying that, you know, people rejoiced because it was a Black woman in her role, and that was a really big deal. But then they seem to disregard the fact that she's up against a 100-year-long culture. And so I say the same thing about the prosecutor's office that I do about cops, is that a prosecutor can be Black, brown, female, male, whatever, and at the top of the entire system, And there will be entire courthouses that don't pay attention to a word that person says. And I think that's what Cathryn was referring to, that literally I will get a totally different offer on the exact same facts on a case in Bridgeview than I will at a case in Markham, or that I will in front of a judge in 26th Street. And it all is based on the prosecutor and their reasonableness and their discretion. And that is problematic. And so I will say this, since Kim has been in office, that there seems to be more discretion at the level of the courtroom prosecutors. But on the flip side, that doesn't make them any more reasonable. And so you will have great prosecutors who will bend over backwards, who will eyeball a case in 5 minutes and say, yes, I'm going to give you deferred prosecution. Yes, I'm going to offer your client this type of probation or this type of program. And you'll have someone else who won't even look at the file, who won't even look at the video, who won't even interview the officer, and will be offering your client with no background damn near max time. So I'm not sure how we deal with that. I'm not sure how we weed out prosecutors. We certainly can't sue them. They're all immune. We can't, so I would love to report them all, but then there's backlash for that. So if you go up against them again, or they become a judge 6 months later, then you have to deal with the repercussions of that for your new client who's standing next to you, should they be punished for the fight that you had with an old client 6 months before. So I don't really have much hope when it comes to the prosecutor's office. I think that's something that, yes, we can put pressure on them. Yes, you can vote in different head prosecutors, but I think Kim Foxx has been one of the better ones since I've been practicing. I've been practicing almost 22 years, and still the results aren't always great. Yes, in some courtrooms, it's outstanding. In other courtrooms, I may as well have not even had a conference with the state. I may as well have not even sent a mitigation package, because they are ultimately unreasonable, out of touch. They have no connection to my clients or my clients' lifestyle. They have no idea, no sense of relatability. And that makes my job, therefore, much more difficult. I end up trying cases that should have never made it to trial because they probably should have never been charged, or it means I have to go into a 402 to beg the judge, but the judge still does not control the charge. So I think there's a lot of movement that can be made, but will it be made and how it will be made, I have absolutely no idea.
Well, April, if I gave you the impression that I am an optimist, then I'm not communicating well. But
she just said that she was the most pessimistic.
Oh,
so,
okay.
Not that we're optimists, but she's just going to put herself at the extreme end.
Okay. Well, I agree with you, and I don't, because I think you're right that Kim Foxx is under her coming in, she's having to operate in a system that has existed for decades, that has been an overtly racist system that is, allowed for, prosecutions based on torture, victims of torture by a Chicago police commander that was prosecuted by someone who then became our mayor. So yes, she is in a really difficult position. And I really appreciated that during her first term. But during the second term, I think that there's an obligation within the administration to start taking on some of these individual prosecutors, looking at them, rewarding people who are looking critically, for example, at police, at cases involving misconduct. If I file a motion to suppress, and it is obvious that the officers engaged in illegal behavior, and it happens to be the same officer from the 11th district that I have filed motions to suppress on in 6 other cases, then maybe that office should be like, you know what, we're not going to go through this charade. We're not going to make you go through this. We're not going to, because we are not going to endorse what that police officer is doing. There is a particular officer in our community. Everybody knows he's bad. He even had an adverse credibility finding entered against him, and then somehow it got reversed. He is now like pairing up with prosecutors on special gang cases. So his behavior is being rewarded internally, while at the same time people are speaking out against police misconduct. And so I don't think that she's going to be able to achieve a culture shift, But I think the time is now to start putting in some like real policies and enforcing those policies, and also putting in supervisors that will say, that will reward just and fair behaviors, and, you know, admonish people when they're not engaging in the kinds, they're not actually honoring the principles that Kim Foxx stands for. Because I believe her when I believe a lot of the things that she says, but her saying them doesn't mean much of anything if the prosecutors who are making the decisions over my young people's lives don't believe in them.
So, I mean, Cathryn, you bring up a good point about culture shift and whose responsibility is it to create the big movement in a culture shift, right? So we all work in organizations that have a kind of a culture, right? And these larger systems have cultures as well that are codified, right? The same things that April is out there fighting all the time, right? And as she so eloquently put, you know, for the big fight that I did with the client last year, you know, that could have a ripple effect on the client that I'm representing next year. So me as a criminal defense attorney, I have to even walk, you know, a fine line within that, right? But that culture shift kind of, you know, we can't escape the power dynamic that we're talking about. And where does the responsibility lie to shift that power in a meaningful way that significantly moves the needle? Not, you know, these little courtroom by courtroom things, or the one bad apple, which is kind of what we're talking about, you know, like that one bad prosecutor or that one bad law enforcement. So even if there is enough courageousness by some, you know, supervising attorney to get rid of that guy and to admonish him for bad behavior and to set up some, you know, meaningful system of rewarding people for doing what they should be doing in the first place, kind of like giving kindergartners a graduation party, you know, then where does the big culture shift though happen, right? So once we've weeded out these few little bad apples, there's still that looming 100-year-old codified system of bad actors that, you know, is still a part of that system, which then takes me to another point that we've talked about earlier, which is accountability. There are a lot of rules and regulations and policies that are already on the books that we are just not holding our systems accountable for actually enforcing. And whose job is that actually, right? Where does that power lie? Is it mine as the electorate? You know, do I get to have a say in that that Bill of Rights that exists for the state of Illinois and a few other handfuls of states that says, you know, the mayor can't actually fire a cop unless they go through these other hoops that most people out there on the street have no idea that something like that even exists, right? So, you know, where does the responsibility lie, and who actually has the ability to shift the levers and really to pull back the curtain on the wizard behind the screen? Right. And most people, everyday folks, don't even know that there's a lever or even a curtain to pull back, because the last time they had a civics lesson was in 8th grade. Right. So the last time they even were taught about how the system works or how they can have any kind of impact on the system is a civics lesson that happened when they were 15 or 16 years old. And so, you know, there are people in this room and other people that are at our ilk that share our, you know, pedigree and degrees that are in positions of power to do something really about it, that are still continuing to look to the left and to the right and say, well, it's really not me, right? It's this other person's job to make that happen, or so-and-so should be doing something differently or better.
So just to sort of, I'm going to preview some of the things that I wanted to talk about on the hopes that if my internet cuts out again, Sharone can help me moderate this. And I really, really apologize. I feel real bad about how my internet's been going.
It's COVID. You get a blanket COVID.
A little ray of sunshine. So we passed the Pretrial Fairness Act. Pretrial Fairness Act makes Illinois the first state in the country to eliminate money bond. We've replaced it with a system. I just ran numbers today, and yearly it is going to hopefully keep 6,000 or more people out of the Cook County Jail, just using its the provisions of it that don't allow certain kinds of charges to be jailed. It's this very exciting thing. We have a year and a half to implement it. How the heck do we get our electeds to embrace this change instead, and not just our electeds, but our systems, which hate change, to embrace this change instead of fighting it. And then the last thing I want to talk about that I'll just sort of put out there for y'all to think about as we're ruminating is, so when I talk to reporters about this stuff, which happens all the time, that reporters want to know, okay, so, you know, what's the story? What should we be talking about? Every single time they say, can you find me a person who has suffered because of this so I can talk to them and often tokenize them, put them on the front page of the paper, and because that's what tells the story. I often can't do that or won't do that, and as a result, we don't get printed. How do we tell our stories, the stories that we have to tell, in an authentic way that doesn't further marginalize and tokenize our communities? So those are the two things I want to talk about. One, hope, and hopefully can give us some hopeful stuff to look at as we move forward. Sharone, you want to start us out on the PFA?
Yeah, I'll start off. You know, I think that we would be, I hope that we could train all of our public officials to embrace the PFA, embrace the end of money bond, embrace the reduction of pretrial incarceration with open arms, and everybody sings Kumbaya, and we go get rainbow cone and walk on the beach. There are lots of jurisdictions that suggest that that's not the case. So we need to be open with our partners across the law enforcement community. We need to make sure that they're educated about what the bill actually does. That's actually a big problem. Even though it's passed, 5-6 months ago, there are still just wild stories about what the bill does and what the bill doesn't, and there are people just aren't educated about it. But once we get past that, we have to understand and listen, there is a long history of people defining public safety by locking people up. And there's a long history of us scapegoating the court system for our failures to not provide communities, or failures to provide communities what they need, which exacerbates violence. So we just have to be prepared for a fight. That's what it comes down to. And we have to make sure that we are stiffening the backs of our allies so that they don't falter under pressure. That's what we saw in New York. We saw folks who were allies become rivals, that they decided that the common story and of public safety was something they were just going to abide by, and they were going to go back on their commitments. We at the Public Defender's Office will do our best to educate our attorneys, educate the people that we are working with, whether it's the judges or the state's attorney's office or the city, and talk about how this is not just an experiment. This is the right thing to do. That Black women paying bonds by the millions was a broken policy, right? That only happened because it's mainly Black women that are paying the bonds, and we're okay with it. And that there's a new way, and we'll try to work with them. But the fact of the matter is we're going to have to fight. There will be attempts to roll this bill back. And there will be attempts to say that, oh my God, this has caused the violence. Listen, I've gotten death threats, all right, my organization at my old shop about my advocacy for this bill. And I've had people blame situations that are happening now for a bill that doesn't come into effect until 2023. So we know that we aren't really playing with people who are playing fair, right? We know that we're playing with people who are just playing a game, right? Who like to criminalize and who like to use race to demonize the people. So with that said, we're going to work hard at the PD's office to implement this thing, but we're getting prepared for a fight. We've seen it in New Jersey, we've seen it in New York, we've seen it in New Mexico, we've seen it in Alaska, we've seen it in Atlanta. Anytime a jurisdiction has tried to take a step forward, there have been people trying to pull us back.
So I'm going to follow up on that because I kind of want other people's thoughts on this part of it too. Do the facts matter in these conversations? So you just said everybody is lying on what is in this bill, which is true. Lots of crazy stuff. There's lots of things that are being said And as a double University of Chicago degree, frankly, my immediate reaction is, let's explain that they are wrong. How much do you think that matters in this narrative to sort of put facts out there about, that they're simply incorrect, that, for example, bond reform is causing violence, or that they're simply incorrect that the bill contains a measure that will mean that police can't arrest peeping Toms? How much does that matter, and or is that a distraction? Because there's definitely people who think that's a distraction and a lost cause, and we should be leaving it behind.
I'll jump in and just go back to my letter E, all of the above, right? Again, this kind of posits that the answer has to be one or the other. And I think that that's exactly the kind of thinking that we have to push ourselves not to fall prey to, which is, we can't somehow another chew gum and walk at the same time. So, as old folks will often say, kind of talking to a fool is, it's pointless, right? So we saw an election happen in this country that, left us aghast, and we're somehow shocked, because it didn't make sense. Right. And we were saying to ourselves, well, if we can only just, present the facts that are opposite and present real facts instead of fake facts. But it didn't make any difference, right? It didn't make any difference how often somebody came out with like the quote unquote truth or the real facts, because of this other, kind of cult of personality or unwillingness to see a different side. But that doesn't mean that we still don't put the truth out there. But I think there are a lot of jobs for a lot of people and a lot of roles that need to be played. And so while I may not have to be the one to go out and present real facts in opposition to fake facts, that might be somebody else's job. And then I keep doing what I'm doing in my space, and Cathryn's doing what she's doing in her space. April's doing in what she's supposed to do in her space. So rather than think of, does it make a difference or doesn't it make a difference? We all have a role in this, in my opinion, to play. And so rather than say we don't spend more time, but it might be a distraction for me, for my work, because I know that the folks that I'm talking to, it's not going to make any difference if I give them real facts versus the ones that are in their head. But allow me to talk about something that we haven't really kind of, touched. We're talking about adult lawyers, adult judges, and everybody by the time they've gone through law school. This culture we're talking about or talking around, it happens at a very young age. It's at dinner tables and in people's homes about how we feel about one another, how we regard Black bodies, how we think about slavery and what the current, law enforcement and its connection to what slavery looked like, right? Are we having those conversations early enough so that, and I do believe probably all of us on this panel teach law school somewhere, or teach a class to undergraduates or somebody, what are you saying in your classrooms to the future lawyers, right? So by the time it's the same argument we have with young teachers. By the time they get into the classroom, they're like, well, I can't make any change because nobody wants me to change, So that's the work we have to do.
I think that I agree with you. And I think that there are different venues for people to tell speak the truth to different types of audiences. I think I would start out by saying facts should matter to all of the people that are watching this webinar, because what I have found is that, there are people who vote the right way and who support my work and who make the right donations, and they, went and marched, in the protests, but they are afraid of the people that I represent. They're afraid of them. They see, when I tell them the individual stories of a young person, 14, 15, 16, 20-year-old, 22-year-old who I represent, and let them get to know that person, they're not afraid of them. But the way that our young people are portrayed as, someone with a gun is suddenly scary, right? Like, I'm a lot more scared of these white people at the Capitol with guns than I am with the kids in, on the west side of Chicago, because these, there's a difference on why you carry it, or the fact that everybody's assuming that people are guilty if they are arrested for things, or they're assuming that people being, if they're not in jail and they're just on EM, that's not so bad. I mean, I think that all of the people that are participating in this webinar have a real responsibility to themselves and to their colleagues. So when they read something in the Chicago Tribune that is, talking about some, this violent offender release, remember, he hasn't been convicted of anything, and why don't you find out a little bit about that backstory? I also think, Tanya, to your point, that we can't, sometimes we can't like put all the facts out there. But I think, for example, as lawyers, I think the more we file motions and make it part of the public record, and we're making things that the judges like actually, we can point to and say, we said this before. Same with when we're talking about, bad policing or any of these other things. I think that the more we make it part of the public record, then we're giving people more facts that they can access and truths that they have to review. So I think it's incumbent upon all of us to do it in the way that we can, but also to examine the facts ourselves.
So I think one of the important things that we need to think about is that I think that there are people that don't like come from our perspective, right? That aren't steeped into the criminal legal system, right? Who will say, listen, somebody just got shot outside my corner or on my corner. Somebody just, I know 2 or 3 people that have been killed. Like, we have to acknowledge the fact that this community violence is real. I think the question, though, that we always have to be asking ourselves is our current solution working to reduce that harm? And I think the true racism in the system, well, there are lots of places where the racism in the system, but the true racism in the system is the solutions that we present for the things that we need to survive are so broken, yet we are completely unwilling to go away with them. We spend billions and billions and billions and billions of dollars on keeping our communities safe. Everybody knows that it doesn't work, and nothing ever changes, right? We have communities in which are just wrecked by violence. They are wrecked by disinvestment. And the people that make the most money in those communities are the police officers who drive back off to the northwest side and the southwest side, and nobody cares about it. We have to have conversations about, is the thing that we're doing right now working? And we have to elect leaders that are willing to say, it's not only that it's not working, but they're going to be courageous enough to make significant changes to that. And I think we have some of the leaders out there that are that courageous, and some of the leaders are not that courageous. You know what? I totally forgot that I'm the moderator.
That's okay. Because I mean, you hit the nail on the head about the courage and the bravery, the accountability, which we kind of keep going back and forth to. But what I keep trying to press us is who gets to hold the folks accountable when they're not being brave? What does actually that look like, right? And so some people say that's voting, right? Some people are like, well, you get to vote for your elected officials. If they're not doing what you want them to do, then vote them out of office, right? But you're given the choice of between bad and badder, right, in your election choices. We've been told and kind of informed, guess what? In Cook County, you can dump a judge, right? If you find out that their sentencing record doesn't look good and is not that it is certainly biased, it's not fair and just, you can actually punch that thing that says do not retain, right? You don't have to keep going through the whole judge's card and hitting yes, 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 because you don't know any better, right? But to the regular everyday person, it's like, do they know about the sentencing record of the people that are on their ballot? Who judges can't actually campaign for themselves, right? It's their friends that do the campaigning, right? Because we've said that's the way we want this set up. So for the everyday person who gets to vote for a judge, they don't know if they should actually be retaining that judge or keeping them. And if it's somebody new, how are they supposed to actually assess their record and figure out, is this somebody that's going to be good for my community or not? And we live here in Chicago, so we know what the name game looks like, right? And I won't call it out because we all know what it is. And that if certain billboards and signs appear in green, what that might mean. And if your last name, kind of is connected to an island that's off of Great Britain, then what that might mean, right? And then you might get more of the votes. And so we are not really setting up enough access to alternative ways of how we can, actually police ourselves better. And so that's why you find, in my opinion, what April's talking about, where young people are like, we don't like any of it. We're going to make up our own systems because all of it's broken and none of it works. And so we're not interested in really reforming it or fixing it because it's so broken that there's really no hope for it ever working in our best interest and that of our families. If you say to the little old lady who lives down the street, defund the police, she's just like, well, I just don't want anybody breaking my house, or my neighbor's house, right? That's really kind of like, this is what safety means to me. And it's the same that safety means to other people. But if you just say to her, defund the police and put money over here and put some money over there, what does that look like for me today? And we're not doing, I think, a good enough job of presenting the present realities as well as what happens long term. And again, it's back to like, whose responsibility is that? And we often stand in the room and say, well, it's not mine, so it must be hers. Well, it's not mine, it must be somebody else's responsibility to fix both the present as well as the future, right? And we're still kind of pointing fingers at each other. Once upon a time, and then April, I'll certainly yield to you, there was only one emergency number, it was 911. If you had an emergency for any kind, right? CAT, DV, somebody got shot, you locked yourself out your house, 911. We have 911. We got 611, we got 311 at a time in my lifetime, right? Why is there no 111 for, I don't want to call the police. I just need the person who's off their meds to not behave in a way that can put myself or them at danger. But I don't want to call the police. Where's that hotline number? And why is that not all over the billboards? And why don't children know how to call that number, right? So these are things that I think can happen right here, right now. But, they're not salacious, they're not sexy, so we don't do them.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback two things that Tanya said. So one about, younger people, I guess it's younger than the millennials, whatever they're called, Z, Generation Z, they just want to burn it all down. And I honestly, I got to side with them, burn it all down, because I was not one of those who got excited when I heard that we weren't going to have a monetary bill. Now, I knew several people involved in the fight. I admired their tenacity, but immediately for me, problems started popping up. I was like, okay, that means we're going to have a bunch of no bond holds. Okay, we still got all this other brokenness that Tanya just talked about. Namely, we still ain't got a solution to all these mentally ill people who are in the system because they acted out during some type of mental illness crisis, and now they're in the system and they shouldn't have been there in the first place. But oops, we have no place to send them because Rahm Emanuel closed down all the mental health centers and nobody has replaced them. And to me, and so I started looking at or wondering why we don't look at other places where things have worked. So namely, if you look at Denver, Colorado, they have a program where, I don't know what the number is, if it's 311-111-222, but you dial where instead of a CIT officer, which I'll get to in a minute, comes to your house, a social worker comes to your house in that situation that Tanya described, and it's been successful there. They've been able to de-escalate, that word we hear all the time, but no police officer actually practices. So they're able to have this little unit that goes out of social workers or mental health care workers, and they're able to transport your loved one to a psych ward. Why can't we do that here? Or you can look at Newark, where they said, you know what, this police station, this police department is broken. Guess what? We're firing everybody. We're bringing in the state police to manage us until we can get our bearings. And then anybody who wants to reapply is welcome to, but guess what? Everything is more stringent now. You got a more stringent psych exam. You got more stringent, whatever other metrics they had in place. And guess what? As a result of that, for 365 days, no police officer even fired his weapon in Newark. And Newark is just as famous as Chicago for its violence, for the violent crime, or at least they were before they put this in place. So I don't really get too excited about any policies that are passed in Illinois, because I'm always like, how can we be doing better? Why can't we look elsewhere where other tactics have worked? I think that because we do have this this whole reputation for being so corrupt, for all of our governors going to prison, for having this political machine, that we are always very hesitant to just look completely outside the box, to try something completely different that hasn't been tried before. And so the no monetary bond is a great first step. But what happens to all the mentally ill people who still have no place to go? What happens to all these dirty cops that are now, passing by all their own CPD billboards that say be the change, but you can come in as a Black or brown or Asian recruit and you're being trained by the 60-year-old white captain who was trained under the old system. So I am more interested in looking completely outside the box, trying something completely different. And hey, if it comes down to it, do what these kids are saying, burn it all to the ground.
So let me take 1 minute to defend some of the changes that this is why I'm excited. And I'm not so much, I'm lying, I'm about to cap. I am excited about the changes, but more than just the changes, what I am excited about is that we had people who were the everyday people that Tanya talked about that put these changes into place. I worked on the bill to end money bond, and I've been talking for years and years and years to legislators and lawyer talk about why this was a good reason to change. The only reason why, though, it happened is because millions of people took the streets to change the culture, and then locally, hundreds of people went to Springfield and demanded change, and then even more local than that, people got in Zoom meetings with their actual legislators and said, this is what we wanted, and then it happened. So I always say it's not time to spike the football for any one change, but what we did see was a shift in the environment. 3 years ago, the changes made by the Safety Act, whether it works or whether it doesn't work, whether it'll be great or whether it doesn't be great, could not have happened. They just couldn't have. We were laughed out of rooms. We were literally laughed out of rooms. And we were able to do this now because everyday people decided, I want to change this. So we see that with the Safety Act. We see that with the judicial movement, right? Unseating a judge had an impact, right? And whether it was just one judge saying, maybe I can't, maybe people watching me, or maybe one judge saying, maybe I need to get out of 26th Street. I know a few of them like that. It had an impact, and that's everyday people. So I just think I'm optimistic, right, that we are on a hot streak and that we can continue to ask for change and just change this momentum that, I don't know, that defines how we do business in Springfield, in the city, in the county.
I just want to push back a little bit. And here's why. We took to the streets. We've taken to the streets before, right? We took to the streets, but people back to power, right? That was like, I'm scared. I'm scared. Michigan Avenue shut down. Things are going haywire. Not like, you know what? They are absolutely right. That is what we should be doing, right? So that's the shift that is still at play, or the mindset that's still at play, right? We take to the streets again, or in another generation, and because folks in power are afraid, whether that be for loss of property or loss of personal safety, then things might shift for that moment, but there's no real change in the mindset. There's no real change in the culture. And Cathryn kind of spoke to that a little bit earlier at the top of the hour when we first started talking, is that a little bit of this is kind of disappointing, because that big reckoning that, we all kind of, or some of us had hoped, it's almost like expediency in some ways, right? Like, this is what we need to do because of X, Y, and Z, not because of the real change in our mindset, right? And so that's the part that, I still have a little bit of pessimism about is that we have to keep repeating the cycle again. We have to keep taking to the streets. We have to keep kind of, have to have the conversation about, well, do the looters, do we, they did a bad thing, unlike the activists, why are we having that conversation, right? So does this have to happen again? So my child, who was arrested on that May at the end of the month last year, who's now, working, got a job, doing his thing, are his kids gonna have to do the same thing? You know, I mean, because I had to do the same thing my parents did. I'd like to see us not have this conversation back to what Sarah said. What is the problem? What are the solutions? Like, can we just stop doing this for a second and do the big seismic shift that we need to take place? And if we can't, then that's why we're left with the burn it all down, thought process. Not because we haven't tried other solutions before, but we have, and we've tried them generation after generation after generation. And so when some of these folks who are getting released out of prison, who've been there way too long, they finally die, right? Their stories are not being told. They're sitting in rooms right now saying, I've been telling the story now for decades. What happens when they're gone and there's nobody to tell that story anymore? Does that mean that the problem is gone? Absolutely not. The problem is not gone. That means it's just still kind of lying dormant, like those seeds under the ground waiting to sprout up when the environment is ripe again for that kind of stinking thinking, if you will. And so, I am not saying that we shouldn't have the take to the streets moments, but I'm ready for us to get beyond the take to the streets and figure out how we start to make lasting change, sustainable change. And if we don't, there will be a hefty price to pay.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And let me try to answer that question. I think that policy does not guarantee that we will have systematic change. That is clear. But I do think that changing people does, right? And I think that if we're expecting that this racial reckoning would change the hearts and minds of people for decades and decades and decades, have subscribed to the idea that young Black people are evil and dangerous, and I have to do all that I can to lock them away. If we thought that protests would change that, we probably were selling ourselves a lie. Right? But I do think that what we have seen through this is not only a change in policy, but this idea that maybe you can change the people in power. So you can tell people to either get down or lay down, right? So either you're going to be a part of this movement or you're not going to be a part of this movement. I see the change in the city council where you have members of the movement who are now a part of the decision-making structure. I look at myself as a 38-year-old quote unquote movement lawyer that is now in this office. We're starting to see the people in power change, and we need to be at the mindset of going to people and saying, if you're not going to operate in the way we want you to operate, we will find somebody else to do your job.
I just like to back what you just said. I think all that's true, but I think that another component we're missing is money. Like, in order to say, get down or lay down, you got to have the money to back that up if somebody's not operating in the way that fits the change that you're going for. And that's oftentimes what the people with the boots on the ground, the activists, lack, is we don't have the money to back up that decision making and push someone aside or back a candidate who actually backs our beliefs. And I think that's always been the problem here. But I also want to say this, I think that I often forget, and I'm not sure how to phrase this, we are unlike at least the majority of the country, because we all live in a major metropolitan area that, although it is segregated, is diverse. And so I think we fool ourselves into believing that what is happening here will impact what happens across the country, and that others in other parts of the country, namely white people, are like the white people who are on the boards, who are on the nonprofits, who are doing the type of work that we're doing. I think that we fool ourselves because, yes, we are in the Midwest, but we are a major metropolitan city in the Midwest, and that makes us a little bit different than what's happening in Wyoming or even in Minnesota or even in St. Louis. And I think that a lot of times because Chicago politics are just such a massive entity, that we fool ourselves into believing that the rest of the US is like us.
Okay, it looks like we only have a few more minutes, so I'm gonna ask for maybe the last comment, whoever wants to close this out. And I'm gonna have a few words about Chicago Appleseed and the Chicago Council of Lawyers. But before that, let's get the final comments out. Let's get the drop the mic moments.
So I'll just jump in with April saying, follow the money. We wouldn't have a dump the judge without donations from lawyers and individual patrons. We wouldn't have so many of the things that need and require money. The Westside Justice Center has more public funding than we have private funding. That public funding goes away, we won't have as much money to give away. So if you want to be a part of the change, I say go to westsidejustice.org, dump a whole lot of money in our coffers so we can continue to do the good work. You can find us at 601 South California, where we're not only providing direct services, but also educating and elevating the mindset of folks, everyday people, opening up the annals of our law books and providing advocacy and putting authentic leadership in the hands of the community.
Okay, I'm gonna jump in, and since she did her shameless plug, I'm gonna do mine as well. So yes, my day job is at Shiller, Preyar, Jarard, and Samuels. But like I mentioned at the beginning, I developed a board game, and my reason for developing a board game, it was to reach young people, the ones who are not in law school, the ones who are not lawyers, the ones who are in elementary school and are in high school and are the most likely to get in trouble, who are most likely to get caught up in group crimes, and they're not going to have the voice to be able to go to their mayor or their legislator and demand change. So the name of the game is Trials and Triumph. And what it does is it literally teaches the players how to interact with police safely so that we don't have another George Floyd. We don't have another Daunte Wright. We don't have another person who's losing their life when interacting with police on the side of the road. And what it also does is teaches young people and their parents, who often don't know this information either, how to stay out of the criminal justice system, and God forbid what happens to you when you get caught in the snares of the criminal justice system. So for this, you can go to justicejunkie.store, and I spell it differently because there is no justice, there's just us, and that's JUSTUSJUNKIE.store.
Cathryn, tell us a little bit about LCLC.
Okay, well, Lawndale Christian Legal Center is a community-based nonprofit law firm. We've been in existence for 11 years, and we provide holistic representation, meaning that every young person that works with us has a lawyer, a case manager, and an outreach worker. And the idea is that while the lawyers who enjoy going to battle in the courthouses and thrive on it, fight the legal cases and try to come up with ways to beat the system, or at least come up with alternative solutions, the case managers are working with the young people to identify their goals, the barriers to those goals, and how to overcome them. And we're at www.lclc.net. I would like also to say that I know that the majority of people watching this or a lot of people are lawyers, and you do have a responsibility to talk to your colleagues who are judges, and don't make assumptions that because this judge is a particular race that he may be a particular, disposed in a particular way, because judges are surprising us. You have a duty to ask your friends, those judges, about the decisions that they're making, and challenge the assumptions of your other friends who maybe not be lawyers, and really take this moment to operate from a position of privilege, meaning that you are trained in the law and you understand the nuances, and start really reflecting and pushing back a little bit to help us in our efforts to move the ball much further.
Okay, we're gonna sign off in a bit. I listen, all three of y'all plug y'all stuff. So I got to plug. I mean, I got to, right? I got to. Listen, I'll tell a quick story. 2000, Illinois ended the death penalty, right? At that point, we had executed more people. We had exonerated more people than we executed, right? So the people that were charged and convicted of the most serious crimes, we had gotten it wrong more times than we had gotten it right. So I say that to say that we are in a system that some people say it's broken, some people say it's not broken. This is the way it was meant to be, but we are in a system that is desperately in need of strong defense. and the consequences are completely serious. Maybe not talking about the death penalty, maybe we're talking about people going to prison for decades, maybe we're talking about people with felonies or misdemeanors. Having an office that is well funded is so important to the liberation of our Black and brown folks. So I'm representing an office that of all the public safety money that the county spends, we account for 4% of it. 4% of it. We might want to make a change to that. So I'll be going to my county commissioners and asking for more funding. So I will be coming to the community and asking y'all to help me support our office, helping to support that liberation work. So thank you so much for that. So let me close this out. I want to thank everyone who joined us today. Please consider supporting the work of Chicago Appleseed and the Chicago Council of Lawyers at chicagoappleseed.org/donate. Or you can use the link below. And we would love for you to attend the second part of the Pro Bono Spotlight next Wednesday, that's the 19th, for a keynote presentation by Dr. Traci Burch, who is a professor of political science at Northwestern University and the American Bar Foundation. I want to thank my friends at the Chicago Appleseed, who is for, is it Center for Fair Courts? Is that it? Center for Fair Courts? I got it.
Fair Courts.
Who has done such a great job over the last years, supporting work around bond reform, supporting work around fines and fees, supporting work around station house representation. They are making the justice system more fair, and for that, I thank them. Thank you all so much for attending, and hope to see you next week.